The glass of the display case shattered under the weight of my skull, a crystalline scream that drowned out the gasps of the Madison Avenue elite. Red mist clouded my vision, copper and salt filling my mouth as I slumped against the mahogany trim. Vanessa stood over me, her designer heel inches from my fingers, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She raised her hand for the second strike, a heavy gold cuff on her wrist catching the overhead LEDs like a weapon. I braced for the impact, closing my eyes, waiting for the darkness to take me fully. Then, the heavy brass doors of the boutique thudded open with a force that rattled the chandeliers. A shadow fell over me, cold and absolute. A hand like a vice gripped Vanessa's wrist midair. Daniel's voice didn't rise, didn't shake, it simply occupied every cubic inch of the room. Try touching my wife again and see what happens next. 6 hours earlier, the world had been quiet, draped in the sterile, high-end silence of my apartment. I was staring at a spreadsheet, calculating the overhead margins for the Hawthorne Foundation Winter Gala. Every line item was a battle of logistics, a delicate dance between high society expectations and the brutal reality of nonprofit budget constraints. I was deep into the fiscal projections for the venue rental when Daniel walked into the office, the scent of expensive cedar and rain trailing behind him. He leaned over the desk, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw before he dropped a folder onto the keys of my laptop. He told me I was allowed to be happy in public, that the charity gala was as much my victory as it was the foundation's. He wanted me at Bellamy's by noon to select the pieces for the keynote presentation. I had hesitated, my thumb hovering over a social media post I'd drafted. In my world, drawing attention was a liability, a habit learned from years of hiding from the storm that was my stepmother's daughter. But Daniel smiled, that rare, private smile that never made it to the tabloids, and told me to post it. I hit share, a digital flare sent into a dark sky, never realizing that a predator was already tracking the signal. The ride to Madison Avenue was a blur of yellow cabs and gray stone. I stepped out into the crisp March air, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the pavement. Inside Bellamy's, the air was pressurized, filtered, and smelled of lilies. The sales associate, a woman whose name tag read Elena, greeted me with the practiced deference reserved for the Hawthorne account. She led me to a private viewing station where a velvet tray held 3 engagement rings, their carats so high they looked like frozen water. I was checking the clarity of a pear-cut diamond, noting the lack of inclusions under the jeweler's loop, when the bell at the front door chimed. I didn't look up. I was focused on the refractive index, on the way the light splintered into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Then, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. A voice I had spent a decade trying to forget sliced through the quiet, calling me trash. I turned, and the first punch landed before I could even process the sight of Vanessa's cream-colored coat. The impact was a blunt force trauma that sent my equilibrium spiraling into a tailspin. My teeth clamped down on the inside of my cheek, and the metallic tang of blood was instantaneous. I didn't fall, not at first. I gripped the edge of the glass counter, my fingers leaving smudges on the pristine surface. Vanessa was breathing hard, her chest heaving under her silk blouse, her eyes wide with a manic sort of triumph. She told me I had always been trash, that I had just learned how to dress better. The shoppers in the store, women in fur and men in bespoke wool, became a blurred gallery of shock. Elena was frozen, a tray of emeralds shaking in her hands. I could see the security guard near the door, a man who looked like he'd been hired for his height rather than his reflexes, reaching for his radio with agonizing slowness. Vanessa stepped into my personal space, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the iron smell of my own blood. She looked at the ring on my finger, a 5-carat legacy piece, and her face contorted with a jealousy so sharp it was almost physical. She told me I thought wearing that ring made me somebody, but that I was nothing before Daniel. I straightened my spine, the pain in my face radiating up into my temple like a rhythmic pulse. I told her to leave, my voice sounding thick and foreign to my own ears. She didn't move. Instead, she laughed, a jagged sound that lacked any real mirth. She said I had stolen a life that belonged to her, that everything I had, the career, the husband, the security, was a clerical error she intended to correct. She raised her hand again, her palm open this time, ready to leave a mark that wouldn't just bruise the skin but would shatter the last of my dignity in front of the Madison Avenue crowd. If you've ever seen a person reveal their true colors like this, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone. The doors swung open again, and this time, the air didn't just move, it surrendered. Daniel entered with a kinetic energy that stopped everything in the room. He didn't look at the jewelry. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at the red handprint blooming on my face. His security detail moved with tactical precision, flanking the exits and creating a perimeter that cut Vanessa off from the rest of the world. Daniel's hand moved faster than I could track, catching Vanessa's wrist just inches from my skin. His grip was a clinical demonstration of power, firm enough to immobilize but controlled enough to avoid the messy complications of a counterassault. He told her to try touching me again. The silence that followed was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the velvet trays and the diamond displays. Vanessa, for the first time in her life, looked small. The security guard finally found his voice, mentioning the police and the protocols for a public disturbance. Daniel told him to call them, his gaze never wavering from Vanessa's eyes. She tried to play it off, tossing her hair and claiming I was being dramatic, that she had barely touched me. The lie was so transparent it felt like an insult to the room's collective intelligence. Elena, the sales associate, stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. She told the room that Vanessa had struck me in front of everyone. The shift in Vanessa's expression was a study in panicked recalculation. She had expected a silent victim, someone who would shrink into the background to avoid a scandal. She hadn't accounted for the fact that in this room, under these lights, she was the only intruder. Daniel removed his charcoal coat and draped it over my shoulders, the weight of the wool grounding me as the adrenaline began to ebb and leave behind a cold, shaky exhaustion. He asked me if I was dizzy, his voice a low frequency that only I was meant to hear. I told him I was, a little. He turned to his lead security officer and gave a series of rapid-fire instructions. Call the doctor. Meet at the hospital. Secure every frame of surveillance footage from the store's digital video recorder. Vanessa let out a shrill, disbelieving laugh, asking if he was really taking me to a hospital over a slap. I corrected her. I told her it was a punch. She looked at me with a betrayal so profound it was almost comical, as if by testifying to my own reality, I was committing an act of treason against our shared history. She told me I always loved playing the victim. That sentence was the catalyst, the final chemical reaction that turned years of passive endurance into a solid, unyielding strength. I told her no, that she had just loved making me one. The room went silent again. An older woman near the pearl display whispered her approval, a small sound that felt like a landslide. Vanessa crossed her arms, trying to regain some semblance of her former stature. She asked me if I thought Daniel would stay once he saw who I really was. Daniel didn't give me the chance to answer. He told her he knew exactly who I was, and that the only remaining question was whether she understood the legal and professional implications of what she had just done. The sirens began as a faint wail in the distance, growing louder as they bounced off the glass towers of the Upper East Side. Vanessa's confidence was flickering like a dying bulb. She claimed she hadn't done anything to deserve this level of scrutiny. Daniel stepped forward, not into her space, but into her reality. He listed her actions with the cold efficiency of an auditor. Trespass. Assault. Public disturbance. Threats in front of witnesses. He told her it ended today. When the NYPD officers entered the store, the narrative was already set in stone. There was no room for her frantic explanations or her claims of family provocation. The officers took statements from the customers and the staff, their pens moving across notepads with a finality that made Vanessa's face go pale. At the hospital, the clinical lights of the exam room were a harsh contrast to the warm glow of the jewelry store. Daniel sat in the plastic chair by the bed, his phone vibrating with the frantic inquiries of the city's power brokers. He ignored them all. He asked me if she had threatened me before. I hesitated, the old instinct to minimize, to protect the peace, fighting against the new requirement for total transparency. I admitted to the messages, the emails, the digital stalking I had tried to block out. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He told me I didn't have to minimize danger to keep the peace with him. The realization hit me harder than the punch had. I had been living in a defensive crouch for so long that I didn't know how to stand up straight. The following morning, the machinery of the Hawthorne legal department began to grind Vanessa's life into fine dust. The surveillance footage arrived in a high-resolution file, showing every second of the assault from 4 different angles. A protective order was filed before the sun was fully up. By noon, the video had leaked into the private channels of the luxury branding firm where Vanessa worked. By 2 o'clock, she was on administrative leave. She called me that evening, her voice a jagged edge of fury and desperation. She asked me if I thought I had won, if I thought my marriage gave me the right to destroy her. I told her I hadn't destroyed her, that she had done that herself. She told me I was supposed to stay where I belonged. For the first time, her words had no weight. They were just vibrations in the air. I told her I didn't belong under her foot, and I never did. I hung up the phone and looked at Daniel, who was standing in the doorway. He took the phone from my hand, his touch a silent vow. He told me she wouldn't get another chance to come near me. For the first time in my life, the world felt safe. The legal system moves with a glacial, unfeeling precision that most people only see in movies, but when the Hawthorne legal team is involved, the gears turn with a terrifying mechanical speed. By the end of the first week, Vanessa's life had been reduced to a series of billable hours and discovery motions. My attorney, a man named Marcus who spoke in quiet, measured tones that made the air feel heavy, sat me down in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Midtown. He laid out the strategy like a general preparing for a siege. We weren't just going for a restraining order, we were documenting a pattern of systemic harassment that dated back to my move to New York. Marcus flipped through a stack of papers, printouts of the emails Vanessa thought she had deleted, IP addresses traced back to her apartment in Chicago, and metadata from the anonymous social media accounts she used to ghost me. He told me that in the world of high-stakes litigation, silence is a commodity, but the truth is a weapon. I sat there, watching the sunlight glint off the chrome edges of the table, feeling the weight of the evidence. It wasn't just about the punch in the jewelry store anymore. It was about every time she had tried to diminish my light so she could feel brighter. Marcus pointed out a specific clause in the filing regarding the Hawthorne Foundation's reputation. Because the assault happened during an official fitting for a charity event, the legal repercussions were compounded by the damage to the foundation's brand. Vanessa hadn't just hit her sister, she had assaulted a representative of a multi-billion-dollar philanthropic entity. The stakes had shifted from a family squabble to a corporate liability. Marcus looked at me over his spectacles and asked if I was ready to see this through to the absolute end, no matter how much her mother pleaded for leniency. I told him I had spent 20 years being lenient with my own dignity. I was finished with that. The phone calls from my stepmother started that night. She didn't call Daniel, and she didn't call the lawyers. She called my personal cell, her voice a fragile, trembling thing that she used like a surgical instrument. She talked about family blood, about how Vanessa was going through a phase, and how a criminal record would follow her for the rest of her professional life. She asked me if I really wanted to be the reason my sister ended up in a cell or on probation. I stayed silent, listening to the static on the line, remembering the night my father died and how she had moved his belongings into the garage before the funeral was even over. I realized then that their version of family was a one-way street where I was the only one expected to follow the traffic laws. If you've ever had a relative try to guilt-trip you into accepting abuse, hit the like button so I know I'm not the only one who had to go cold. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply told her that the matter was in the hands of the district attorney and hung up. Daniel was standing by the window, watching the lights of the city flicker like 1,000 grounded stars. He didn't ask what she said. He knew. He walked over and took the phone from my hand, placing it face down on the marble counter. He told me that some people mistake kindness for a lack of options, and that Vanessa was about to learn that my kindness was a choice I was no longer making. We spent the rest of the evening in a comfortable, focused silence, the kind of silence that exists between two people who are preparing for a storm they know they can survive. The deposition was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10. The room was small, clinical, and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Vanessa was already there, sitting next to a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. She wore a high-collared black dress, an attempt at looking somber that was betrayed by the restless, angry tapping of her manicured nails on the table. When I walked in, she didn't look at me. She looked at Daniel, her eyes darting to his watch, his suit, the way he pulled out my chair. It was the look of a person calculating the value of everything in the room except for the human beings inside it. The court reporter began the rhythmic tapping of the stenograph, and the atmosphere in the room tightened until it felt like a wire stretched to the breaking point. Marcus started with the basics. He established the timeline of her arrival in New York. He presented the logs from the hotel where she had stayed under a false name, a detail I hadn't even known until that moment. She had been in the city for 3 days before the jewelry store incident. She hadn't just bumped into me. She had been hunting. I watched her face drain of color as the receipts were laid out, one by one. The lawyer on her side tried to object, claiming the hotel records were irrelevant to the assault charge, but Marcus countered with the intent to harass. He was building a cage out of cold, hard facts, and Vanessa was starting to realize that the bars were already closing in. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my eyes on the court reporter's hands. I described the moment at the counter. I described the sound of her voice. I didn't use adjectives. I didn't use emotional language. I used nouns and verbs. I told them how her hand felt against my face. I told them what she said about my place in the world. Vanessa interrupted once, a sharp, hissed denial that the mediator silenced with a single look. In that moment, I realized that her power over me had always been a hallucination. It relied on my fear, and without that fear, she was just a woman in an expensive dress who had lost control of her own narrative. As we walked out of the deposition, the hallway was a long, narrow stretch of fluorescent light and beige carpet. Vanessa's lawyer was whispering to her in a corner, his gestures hurried and sharp. He was likely telling her about the plea deal the DA was offering, a deal that included a mandatory psychiatric evaluation and a permanent order of protection. Vanessa looked up as we passed, and for a split second, the mask slipped. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization that the world didn't care about her resentment. She was a footnote in a Hawthorne press release, a minor complication that was being handled with surgical precision. Daniel didn't even glance her way. He kept his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the elevators with a steady, unhurried grace. As the doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of her standing there, alone in the beige hallway, clutching her designer handbag like it was a life raft. I felt a strange flicker of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't joy. It was the feeling of a phantom limb finally ceasing to itch. The connection was severed. The history was closed. We reached the lobby, and the glass doors opened to the roar of the city, a sound that no longer felt like a threat, but like a symphony of possibilities. The news broke on the financial wires first, a small blip about the Hawthorne Foundation's increased security measures and a pending legal matter involving a private individual. Within an hour, the gossip blogs had picked it up, fueled by a leaked cell phone video from a customer who had been hiding behind a display of Swiss watches. The video was grainy, but the sound was unmistakable. The crack of the strike. Vanessa's voice calling me trash. And then, the entrance of Daniel, looking like a vengeful god in a bespoke coat. The public reaction was swift and brutal. In the age of viral accountability, there is no hiding from a video like that. Vanessa's employer didn't wait for the legal outcome. They issued a statement within 4 hours, distancing themselves from any form of violence or harassment. She was officially unemployed by sunset. That night, the apartment was flooded with the scent of fresh peonies Daniel had ordered. I sat on the sofa, scrolling through the comments on the news articles. Most people were focused on the billionaire savior angle, but every so often, I'd see a comment from someone who understood the deeper layer, the look in my eyes when I stood my ground. I realized then that the jewelry store hadn't been my lowest point. It had been my graduation. I wasn't the girl from Chicago who was lucky to be here. I was the woman who had built a life so solid that even a direct hit couldn't knock it down. Daniel sat down beside me, handing me a glass of wine. He told me that the DA's office had officially moved forward with the charges. There would be no more phone calls, no more emails, and no more family meetings. He looked at me with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. He said he hadn't married me because I needed a protector. He married me because he had never seen anyone fight for their own soul with such quiet dignity. I looked at the fading mark on my cheek in the reflection of the window. It was almost gone. The skin was healing, the tissue knitting itself back together, stronger than it had been before the break. The winter gala was only 3 weeks away. I had a foundation to run, a speech to write, and a life to live that didn't include looking over my shoulder. As I closed my laptop, I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it felt like a physical weight leaving my chest. Vanessa had tried to take my voice, but all she had done was give me a bigger stage to use it. I took a sip of the wine, the notes of dark cherry and oak lingering on my tongue, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one walking in the shoes now, and the path ahead was perfectly clear. The gala preparations became a masterclass in high-stakes project management. I spent 14 hours a day submerged in the technical specifications of the Hawthorne Foundation's grandest night, coordinating with logistics teams and fine-tuning the security protocols. We were expecting 400 of the city's most influential figures, which meant the margin for error was non-existent. Every caterer, every florist, and every technician had to undergo a Tier 1 background check. Daniel watched me work from the periphery, his presence a silent anchor in the chaos of floral arrangements and seating charts. He knew I needed this to be perfect, not for him, but to recalibrate the scales of my own identity. I was no longer the girl who had things happen to her, I was the one making things happen. 10 days before the event, a package arrived at the office. It was an unmarked courier envelope containing a thick stack of printed photographs. My heart skipped a beat as I slid them out onto my desk. They were shots of me and Daniel, taken from long distances with a telephoto lens. Us leaving the hospital. Us walking the dog in the park. Us sitting on the terrace at sunset. On the back of the final photo, written in a jagged, frantic hand, were the words, "Everything you have is borrowed." The ink was still fresh enough to smudge under my thumb. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I picked up the desk phone and dialed the direct line to our head of security. If you've ever felt the hair on your neck stand up because you knew you were being watched, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone in that instinct. The security team was in my office within 3 minutes. They took the photos with gloved hands, their faces grim and professional. They traced the courier back to a local bike messenger service that had been paid in cash by a woman fitting Vanessa's description, despite the protective order. She was playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, testing the boundaries of the law to see how much pressure she could apply before the walls closed in. Daniel arrived shortly after, his face like a piece of carved granite. He didn't offer platitudes. He looked at the photos and then at me. He told me that she was looking for a reaction, a crack in the foundation we had built. He said that the best way to defeat a ghost is to stop believing in its power to haunt you. We doubled the detail at the apartment and moved the gala's final walkthrough to a secured time slot. The morning of the gala, the city was draped in a fine mist that turned the skyscrapers into ghostly silhouettes. I stood in the center of the ballroom, watching the lighting crew adjust the gels on the overhead spots. The room was a sea of navy and silver, designed to feel like a winter midnight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from the legal team. Vanessa had failed to show up for her mandatory psychiatric evaluation. A bench warrant had been issued for her arrest. The news should have made me feel safe, but instead, it felt like the final click of a trap being set. I knew her better than the lawyers did. I knew that when Vanessa felt cornered, she didn't hide. She exploded. I spent the afternoon in the vanity chair, watching a stylist transform my reflection into someone I barely recognized. The makeup was architectural, highlighting the sharpness of my cheekbones and the steady resolve in my eyes. I chose a dress of deep charcoal silk that flowed like liquid metal, a suit of armor for the modern age. When I stepped into the foyer, Daniel was waiting. He looked at me with an expression that went beyond admiration. It was a profound sort of recognition. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace of raw, uncut diamonds, a stark contrast to the polished stones I had been holding when Vanessa struck me. He said they were like me, unbreakable and brilliant even in their natural state. The gala was a blur of flashbulbs and handshakes. I moved through the room with a practiced grace, navigating the social currents of Manhattan's elite with the ease of a seasoned diplomat. Every time a door opened or a guest arrived late, a small part of me braced for a scene, for a scream, for the shattering of glass. But the hours ticked by in a steady rhythm of champagne toasts and silent auctions. The Hawthorne Foundation raised more in that single night than it had in the previous 3 years combined. I stood at the podium to deliver the keynote, looking out over the sea of faces, and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for Vanessa in the crowd. I was looking at the future. The climax of the night was the unveiling of a new scholarship fund in my father's name. As the digital screen behind me displayed the logo, the room erupted in applause. I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Daniel smiling. But as the lights dimmed for the final video presentation, a shadow moved near the service entrance. A woman in a dark hooded cloak was weaving through the catering staff, her movements frantic and out of sync with the room's elegant pulse. My breath hitched in my throat. I saw the glint of something silver in her hand. Security was already moving, but they were across the room, blocked by a wall of high-profile donors. I didn't wait for them. I stepped off the stage and moved toward her, my charcoal silk dress whispering against the floor. We met in the dim light of the side aisle, away from the cameras and the glare of the spotlight. She pulled back her hood, and I saw the wreckage of my stepsister's face. She was pale, her eyes bloodshot, her hair a matted mess beneath the expensive fabric. She looked like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt. She raised the silver object, and for a second, I thought it was a knife. Then I realized it was the heavy gold cuff she had been wearing in the jewelry store, the one she had tried to hit me with. She was shaking so hard the metal rattled. She hissed that I had taken everything from her, her job, her reputation, her mother's pride. She said I had stolen her life and turned it into a circus. I looked at her, and for the first time, the anger was gone. In its place was a cold, clinical pity. I told her that I hadn't taken anything. I had just stopped letting her take things from me. I told her that the police were outside and that this was the last time she would ever see me. She lunged, a desperate, clumsy move fueled by nothing but spite, but she tripped on the hem of her own cloak. 2 security officers caught her before she hit the ground, their movements efficient and silent. They led her out through the service door into the cold March night, where the blue and red lights were already waiting. I turned back to the room, smoothed my dress, and walked back to my husband. The gala continued, the music swelled, and the world kept turning, but for me, the storm had finally passed. The doors of the service entrance clicked shut with a finality that echoed louder in my mind than the orchestral swell of the ballroom. Vanessa was gone, removed like a glitch in a high-resolution image, leaving nothing behind but the faint, sour smell of her desperation. I stood in the shadows of the side aisle for 5 seconds, breathing in the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, waiting for my heart rate to descend from its frantic peak. Daniel appeared at my side as if he had sensed a shift in my oxygen. He didn't ask if I was okay, he took my hand and felt the pulse in my wrist, his thumb pressing against the vein with a steady, grounding pressure. He looked at the door where she had vanished and then back at me, his eyes dark with a protective fury that he was keeping under a layer of professional polish. He whispered that it was over, truly over this time, and I realized that for the first time in 20 years, I believed him. We returned to the head table as the final video presentation concluded, the room bathed in the soft, blue glow of the Hawthorne Foundation's logo. I sat down and picked up my water glass, my hand steady as a surgeon's. The adrenaline had left a strange, hyper-lucid clarity in its wake. I looked out at the donors, the celebrities, and the city officials, and I saw them not as a wall of judgment, but as a network of resources I could now direct towards something meaningful. The trauma of the jewelry store had been the fire that burned away the dross of my old life, leaving only the tempered steel of who I was meant to be. If you've ever had a moment where the person who tried to break you realized they actually made you, hit the like button so I know I'm not alone in that victory. The morning after the gala, the city felt different, as if the air had been scrubbed clean by the previous night's rain. I sat at the breakfast nook in our apartment, a tablet propped up against a carafe of coffee, watching the news cycle move on from the Hawthorne scandal to the Hawthorne success. The headline in the Times focused on the scholarship fund, featuring a photo of me at the podium looking composed and untouchable. In a small sidebar on a local news site, there was a tiny blurb about a woman arrested for trespassing and violating a protective order at a private event. No name was mentioned. No photo was shown. Vanessa had been reduced to a footnote, a minor administrative error in a city of 8 million stories. Daniel joined me, dressed in a crisp white shirt, already reviewing the morning's market openings. He set a physical document on the table next to my coffee, a formal report from Marcus. The bench warrant had been executed, and Vanessa was currently being held pending a bail hearing that our legal team was moving to block. But more importantly, the report detailed a settlement offer from my stepmother's lawyers. They were proposing a total severance. A signed agreement that Vanessa and her mother would never contact me, Daniel, or the foundation again, in exchange for us not pursuing the maximum civil damages that would have bankrupted them both. They were offering me the one thing they had never given me as a child, peace. I looked at the signature line on the document, the white space waiting for my ink. For years, I had thought that justice meant an eye for an eye, a public shaming that matched the one I had endured under the white chandeliers of Bellamy's. But as I held the pen, I realized that real justice was the ability to stop thinking about them entirely. I didn't need their money, and I didn't need to watch them suffer in a courtroom for another 6 months. I needed the silence. I signed the paper with a quick, decisive stroke, the ink drying instantly on the heavy bond paper. I handed it back to Daniel, and the feeling of the weight leaving my shoulders was almost dizzying. The next 72 hours were a blur of administrative closure. I spent my afternoons at the foundation office, finalizing the scholarship criteria and meeting with the first round of applicants. These were students who had survived their own versions of the storm. Young women from the south side of Chicago and the outer boroughs of New York who had been told their place was somewhere lower than their dreams. When I looked into their eyes, I didn't see victims, I saw untapped power. I told them that the world would try to call them trash to see if they believed it, and that their only job was to prove the world wrong. One afternoon, I found myself walking past Madison Avenue, my feet tracing the path toward Bellamy's without my conscious mind even realizing it. I stopped in front of the window where the white chandeliers were still glowing with that same sterile, expensive light. I saw my reflection in the glass, framed by diamonds and gold. I didn't see the girl with the split lip and the terrified eyes. I saw a woman who belonged in the room, not because of her husband's name, but because she had survived the entrance exam. I stepped inside, the chime of the door sounding like a bell at the end of a round. Elena, the sales associate, was there. She recognized me immediately, her face softening into a look of genuine relief. She started to apologize for the day of the assault, for the mess, for the trauma. I stopped her with a small gesture. I told her that she didn't need to apologize for someone else's lack of control. I asked her to show me the piece I had been looking at that day, the pear-cut diamond I had held when the world exploded. She brought it out on the velvet tray, her hands steady this time. I picked up the loop and looked at the stone. The inclusions were still there, tiny imperfections deep within the carbon, invisible to the naked eye but clear under magnification. I realized then that the stone was beautiful not despite its flaws, but because of the way it had survived the pressure required to create it. I handed the loop back and thanked her. I didn't buy the ring. I didn't need a trophy to remember what happened. I walked back out into the New York sun, the noise of the traffic sounding like a celebration. I took a deep breath of the city air, cold and sharp and full of life, and I started walking home. That evening, Daniel and I sat on the terrace as the first stars began to pierce the twilight. The legal battle was over, the gala was a success, and the scholarship was funded. He asked me what I wanted to do next, his voice curious and open. I looked at the skyline, at the millions of windows where other people were fighting their own silent wars, and I told him I wanted to keep going. I wanted to build something that outlived the scandal and the names and the money. I wanted to be the person who stood at the door for the next girl who walked in with nothing but hope and a target on her back. He nodded, his hand finding mine in the dark. He said he had already looked into expanding the foundation's reach to Chicago, to the neighborhood where I grew up. He wanted to build a center there, a place where the old rules didn't apply. I felt a surge of something that wasn't just love, but a profound sense of partnership. We weren't just a billionaire and his wife, we were a team that had survived the siege. As the river turned from blue to black beneath us, I realized that the trash Vanessa had tried to throw away had become the cornerstone of a new empire. The silence between us was no longer the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of a finished chapter. I closed my eyes and listened to the city, the hum of the bridge, the distant sirens, the heartbeat of a place that never stops moving. I wasn't afraid of the noise anymore. I knew that whatever came next, I would meet it standing up. I was no longer defined by the punch that landed, but by the fact that I was the one still standing when the lights came back on. The story wasn't about the jewelry or the money or the revenge. It was about the moment I decided that I was worth the fight. The first meeting for the Chicago Center took place in a boardroom that overlooked the very streets where I had once walked with my head down, trying to be invisible. We were looking at a decommissioned library in a neighborhood that the city had largely forgotten, a brick building with arched windows and a history of endurance. Daniel sat beside me, but for the first time, he remained silent, deferring to my lead as I tore through the architectural drafts and the community outreach proposals. I spoke in the language of urban development and social impact, using the financial jargon I had mastered to ensure this project wasn't just a charity handout, but a self-sustaining engine of growth. I told the board that we weren't just building a facility, we were building a sanctuary for the people the world had written off as disposable. As the meeting wrapped up, a notification flickered on my phone from Marcus. The final disposition of Vanessa's case had been entered into the record. Because of the settlement we had signed and her lack of prior criminal history, her sentence was focused on rehabilitation rather than incarceration. She was ordered to complete 300 hours of community service and 2 years of intensive counseling. The protective order was made permanent, a legal border that she could never cross again. I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction knowing that her punishment wasn't a cell, but a requirement to help the very people she had spent her life looking down upon. If you've ever seen someone get exactly the lesson they needed to learn, hit the like button so I know I'm not the only one who believes in poetic justice. We flew back to New York as the sun was setting, the private jet cutting through a sky that looked like a bruised peach. Daniel watched me from across the cabin, his glass of scotch untouched on the table. He asked me if I felt like the debt was paid. I thought about the white chandeliers of Bellamy's, the taste of blood in my mouth, and the years of shrinking myself to fit into a space Vanessa had carved out for me. I told him that the debt wasn't hers to pay anymore. I had paid it myself the moment I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. The closure wasn't in her suffering. It was in my indifference. 3 months later, I stood in front of a mirror in my dressing room, preparing for the opening of the Hawthorne Chicago Empowerment Center. I wasn't wearing charcoal silk or diamonds. I wore a simple, sharp navy blazer and trousers, the uniform of a woman who had work to do. I looked at the slight, almost invisible scar on the inside of my lip, the only physical map left of that afternoon on Madison Avenue. It didn't look like a mark of shame anymore. It looked like a badge of rank. I had been through the fire, and I had come out as something that couldn't be burned again. The ceremony was small, focused on the families and the young women who would be using the center's resources. There were no cameras from the gossip rags, no paparazzi blocking the sidewalk. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about Daniel or the Hawthorne name. I talked about the day I was punched in a jewelry store. I told them that the world will try to define you by your lowest moment, by the time you were hit or the time you fell. I told them that the strike isn't the story is what you do when you're standing over the glass. I looked out at a front row of teenage girls, their eyes wide and hungry for a truth they could actually use, and I knew that this was the real legacy. After the ribbon was cut, a woman approached me from the crowd. She was older, with tired eyes and a coat that had seen too many winters. She reached out and touched my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. She told me she had seen the video of what happened in New York. She said she had been waiting for someone to show her that you could be hit and not stay down. She didn't call me Mrs. Hawthorne. She called me by my name. I realized then that Vanessa had tried to humiliate me in a room full of strangers, but all she had done was introduce me to the people who needed to hear my voice the most. As the sun went down over the Chicago skyline, I walked out to the parking lot where Daniel was waiting by the car. He didn't say a word, he just opened the door and watched me step inside with a look of profound, quiet pride. We drove away from the center, the brick building glowing in the rearview mirror like a lighthouse in the dark. I leaned my head back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The battle was over, the work had begun, and the girl who had been called trash was now the woman who was changing the world. The story didn't end with a billionaire walking through a door. It ended with me walking through my own. I had spent so long looking for a way out of the shadows that I hadn't realized I was the one holding the light. Vanessa was a memory, a ghost of a life I no longer recognized. My father's name was on a building, my husband's hand was in mine, and my soul was finally, irrevocably, at peace. I took a deep breath, the air smelling of rain and asphalt and the future, and I let go of the last piece of the girl I used to be. I was Amelia Hawthorne, and I was exactly where I belonged.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.